everybody, this is your lecture for pages 73 through 79 of your textbook. Remember, it's always wise to look over the textbook even though I've lectured on it. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how the colonists form a united front against the British, and we're going to see some things that lead up to that. So the first thing you need to realize is that a new ministry in Great Britain began in the year 1767, and that was the ministry of Charles Townshend, who's pictured right here. And he was the Chancellor of Exchequer, and it was his job that was assigned to him by the king to figure out how to raise money so they could pay off all that debt that they were dealing with. And so Townshend was under the impression that the colonists made a distinction between internal taxes and external taxes. So internal taxes are taxes levied within the colonies, such as the stamp tax. And remember, the colonists hated the stamp tax. That was the most hated part of Lord Grenville's plan. Versus external taxes, which are taxes levied on goods imported to the colonies. But it turns out that Townshend was just plain wrong. The colonists just didn't like taxes. And so when he levied his Townshend Acts, the colonists responded much in the same way that they responded to the Grenville program, and that was with protest and with lots of anger. One of the most famous pieces of literature that came out from this time period was from John Dickinson, who was a lawyer and who was responsible for drafting the resolutions of the Stamp Act Congress. He wrote letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the inhabitants of the British colonies, and he basically talked about how Parliament did not have any right to tax the colonies, whether it be internal or external. So it's the same battle cry that we heard earlier from the colonists, which is no taxation without representation. And of course, Parliament would argue that, of course, the colonists are being represented. They're being virtually represented, but the colonists said that wasn't good enough. Okay, so I want you to pause the video here, and you're going to watch an Edpuzzle video on the Boston Massacre. Remember, the colonists are angry, and when there's enough people angry, violence tends to break out, and the Boston Massacre is going to be an example of this. Okay, so you watched the video about the Boston Massacre, and I'm sure that you noticed that it was one of those events that could have been avoided, but it wasn't, and it also characterizes the fervor with which the colonists wanted to defend their rights, and it also characterized the way that the British soldiers and the British government in general felt like they had the right to to have control over the colonists. Okay, so the Townshend Acts were not very successful. The colonists hated them, and there was a lot of tension between England and the colonies. So fortunately for England, when Lord North becomes the Prime Minister of England, he repeals the Townshend Acts. And he does this not because he thinks the colonists are right or anything. He does this because the colonists are a lot of trouble to deal with, and the taxes are actually more trouble to enforce than they're actually worth. Remember, the colonists are figuring out ways to wiggle out of paying the taxes, and they're also outright protesting. So he just decides it's less trouble to just repeal the Townshend Acts. The only one that he does not repeal is the tax on tea. Now, the question is, why does he not repeal the tax on tea? And this has to do with the fact that he wants to prove to the colonists that England has control over them. So there's a temporary peace, sort of, that lasts from 1771 to 1773. However, this peace is not complete, and it is interrupted by something called the Gaspee Incident, which I would like for you to pause the video here, and I would like for you to please watch the Edpuzzle so that you can get an idea of what happened with the Gaspee Incident. Okay, so hopefully you have a good idea that the Gaspee Incident was something of a humorous event in history, if only because of the fact that hundreds of people witnessed it and nobody could give any testimony towards who was actually the perpetrators of the crime. But it does go to show, again, that the colonists are beginning to have a united front. No one wanted to tell on each other. They all were seeing themselves as a part of a whole that were against the British. So just because the years 1771 to 1773 had very little violence doesn't mean that there was no violence, as we've seen with the Gatsby incident. And Sam Adams was not deceived either, and he said that it was very important for the colonists to recognize that there was no real peace with England, and that the current peace was just a temporary one, and that the real problems had not been solved whatsoever. So he decides that he's going to put forth this idea that they need to create something called the Committees of Correspondence. So I want you to pause the video here again, because you're about to watch an Edpuzzle about the Committees of Correspondence. Okay, so the committees of correspondence were designed to help the colonists to communicate with one another. The colonies were able to communicate with one another across the board because of the organization, because of the role that the committees played. And communication is very important and vital to the success of any sort of united front, whether it be a revolutionary one or whether it be that you're trying to plan a party for your best friend for their birthday party. But speaking of parties, we're going to see that new trouble is going to develop for England. So the relatively peaceful time of 1771 to 1773 ended abruptly with the Boston Tea Party, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the Boston Tea Party, but I want you to watch this Edpuzzle about it to just give you a better idea of what was going on with it. So pause your video here. Okay, so you got an idea that the Boston Tea Party was not the kind of party that the authorities like very much, and that actually Great Britain lost a lot of money out of this particular party. So in response to the Boston Tea Party, the British government, Parliament specifically, decided to punish Massachusetts, and by doing so, they set an example that would keep the other colonies in subjugation. Or at least that was the idea. And so they passed the Coercive Acts, which were also called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts because they were simply intolerable, and they were basically designed to close Boston Harbor, and basically that was the source of a lot of jobs for a lot of people, and so when the harbor was closed, a lot of people lost their jobs. And what's really neat about the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts is that the colonists across the East Coast recognized that there were people in Boston who were going hungry and who did not have their needs being met because they didn't have a source of income, and they all banded together and they sympathized with them and they helped them out as much as possible. So again, this shows that the colonies are uniting with one another, and more they're seeing that they're going to be against Britain and that they're going to be for each other. So in June 1774, the First Continental Congress convenes, and it convenes in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774, and all the colonies except for Georgia send delegates. Now, this Congress is very important because of the fact that it adopts certain declarations and resolves which basically say that the colonists have certain rights like life, liberty, and life, liberty, and property, and they've never given those rights to anybody else to speak of, and therefore they have the right over their lives, their liberty, and their property, and therefore the Crown does not have any right to tax them. They also declare that the English colonies were originally founded by Englishmen who were natural born subjects within the realm of England, and that they did not forfeit their rights as Englishmen when they came to the colonies, and therefore the fact that their rights were being violated was breaking their contract with the government, of England, and they were merely protecting their rights as English men. So the resolves ultimately recognize that the king has authority over the colonies, but Parliament does not, and so Parliament does not have the right to tax. But of course, England would respond by saying that King George supports what Parliament is doing, and would not see a distinction between the king and Parliament, but the colonists did. So the First Continental Congress, in addition to its declaration and resolves, also implements a boycott, and this is going to hurt the British because it's going to take away their some source of their income, which, remember, one of the reasons that the whole taxes came about has to do with the fact that England is in debt because of the French and Indian War, and they're trying to make extra money. So when England hears about this First Continental Congress and what their resolves are, England is absolutely horrified and offended, and George III and Lord North both decide that if the colonists are going to be rebels, then they're going to be treated like rebels, and George III famously remarks, "Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent." And so basically, we can see conflict is rising higher and higher, and that war is going to be inevitable if the course does not change. So in the colonies, they are getting really excited and passionate and are actually ready for a war. Men like Patrick Henry particularly. Patrick Henry is famous for talking about the fact that the fast approaching conflict was on the horizon, and he voices the sentiments of a lot of Americans when he says, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And so they're really starting to feel very serious about their rights and what they believe, and Patrick Henry excellently highlights this with his words. And because of the fact that so many people felt this way in the colonies, they were ready to take on a fight. And the war for independence is going to begin early. I mean, technically in 1775 with some skirmishes, which we're going to talk about. But before we can get to the skirmishes, we need to talk about the fact that conflict was inevitable. And the way that you could see this is perfectly highlighted with the city of Boston. So in Boston, the people of Boston are making life as uncomfortable as possible for the British soldiers. For instance, the British soldiers did not have any place to stay. They needed some barracks, and somehow no carpenters or bricklayers could be hired to build the barracks, and they couldn't even find any lumber for sale. And the general of the soldiers ended up having to order out to Nova Scotia to get his troops some winter quarters. So life is uncomfortable for the British, or anybody who is for the British government, versus a lot of the people outside of Boston who were, at that very time that the soldiers were becoming very increasingly uncomfortable, they were actually having training going on, and they were collecting a militia called the Minutemen, and thus they were called because they were ready to fight at a minute's notice. So we're going to pause right here the video, and then I'm going to finish up the lecture in part 2, which it shouldn't be too much longer.